Hello everyone, it's Eric Strong from Strong Medicine. This video is part of my series on Donald Trump's Make America Healthy Again initiative. Each video gives an overview of one position within the federal government related to American healthcare and public health. I talk about what each position does, the background of the person currently holding each position, and as a physician and med school professor, my critique of what they've done so far, and my predictions of what they'll do in the future. RFK Jr. is at the center of Make America Healthy Again. He is at the center from the standpoint of an organizational hierarchy, and he is at the center philosophically, as MAHA is a strong reflection of RFK Jr.'s pseudoscientific, conspiracy theory-laden belief system. I said this in the introductory video for the series. Not everyone within Make America Healthy Again is equally bad. Most of those who will be covered in this video series are fundamentally intelligent people. I may have very strong disagreements on matter of policy, and I may find most to be ill-qualified for their current positions, but most do occasionally make a thoughtful point that is at least worth discussing. Most of these people have some good qualities, and several have already made some positive contributions to the country's health. RFK Jr. is not one of these people. To be blunt, he is the embodiment of the Dunning-Kruger phenomenon, in which he speaks incredibly confidently about things of which he has absolutely no understanding. He routinely cites imaginary statistics to support his policy proposals, which, as vague as they might be, will universally make our healthcare worse. He has no empathy for those of our country who live less fortunate lives than himself, which is almost everyone, and he certainly appears to be selling out our children's health for his personal profit, as I will get to near the end. For years, in addition to anti-vax rhetoric, RFK has talked incessantly about how Americans have poor diets, insufficient physical activity, unacceptable rates of obesity, are exposed to excessive chemicals in our environment, and are in general far less healthy compared to peer countries, despite spending much more on healthcare. It's not only hard to argue with that, it's impossible because, of course, these things are true. Every physician and public health expert has known this for decades. Yet when RFK says it on the Joe Rogan podcast, you have all these Republican politicians and MAGA bros nodding along as if he's the very first person to ever make these observations. But here's the thing. Despite RFK talking about how important it is to address obesity and poor diets, not one of his policy proposals, to the extent that he can even formulate such proposals, addresses any of their root causes. If you want to improve American diets, you can't just yell at people on social media about seed oils and raw milk. You need to address poverty and inequity, so-called food deserts, and agricultural policy that influences how much fresh produce will cost at the supermarket. Does RFK talk about any of this? No. If RFK really cared about too many harmful chemicals in the environment, you'd think he would publicly criticize the current EPA's unprecedented attempts at deregulation. But no, not a peep on that. And if he was truly, really concerned about the incredible discordance between healthcare spending and healthcare outcomes in this country, he would be shouting from the rooftops about the need to drastically reform our for-profit healthcare system, top to bottom, but never a word on that either. His whole shtick is pithy platitudes about health that lack any impactful policy ideas or a hint of understanding as to the true causes of the problems. In short, RFK has no redeeming qualities as the head of HHS. So this video is going to be very negative because it has to be in order to be honest. I don't want you as my viewers to have the expectation that I'm going this hard against everyone in this series. RFK Jr. is just particularly awful among the central players that make America Healthy Again. And the reason the video is particularly long is because I want to leave no doubt that RFK Jr. is killing America. But before discussing the specifics of what makes RFK so awful for the role of HHS Secretary, we need to first understand what even is the Department of Health and Human Services. HHS is part of the executive branch of the federal government. It is tasked with promoting and protecting the health and well-being of Americans. It's undergone a few major reorganizations, but has existed more or less in its current form since 1979. Depending on how you count them, it did have a workforce of around 83,000 people at the beginning of the administration, at the beginning of this year, but RFK Jr. has been firing thousands along the way, so who knows how many are currently employed. The department has many agencies and offices within it, some of which will be familiar to you, such as the NIH, CDC, and FDA, which are responsible for medical research, monitoring infectious diseases, and ensuring the safety of our medications and vaccines, respectively. Responsibility for food safety is shared between the FDA, the Department of Agriculture, and state and local health departments. Under HHS is also the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, which provides medical insurance to almost half of America. The Indian Health Service is distinct from CMS and provides healthcare to about 2 million American Indians and Alaska Natives. The Office of the Surgeon General is also under HHS via a complex organizational structure involving the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Health. And there are many, many smaller agencies, offices, and centers. So in short, the Department of Health and Human Services is a huge part of the federal government, both in size and even more so in impact. It's not an exaggeration to say that HHS has a greater day-to-day impact on the average American than any other part of our federal government. As with other cabinet-level departments within the executive branch, it is administered by one individual who is referred to as the Secretary of HHS. That person is appointed by the President and confirmed by a majority vote of the Senate after hearings are held to discuss the appointee's qualifications and views. Because of how wide the scope is of the HHS, there's actually no expectation of technical expertise of the Secretary. For example, unlike many of its constituent agencies, there's no reason for the Secretary to be a medical professional or scientist themselves. What the Secretary does need is dedication to the mission of HHS, some executive experience managing a large, diverse enterprise, communication skills, and the ability to engender respect and trust from the tens of thousands of people they are overseeing. To provide some idea of who has held this position in the past, under Biden, it was Xavier Becerra, a former congressman and attorney general of California. In Trump's first term, the position was primarily held by Alex Azar, who was a previous deputy secretary of HHS under George W. Bush, and then a pharmaceutical executive for Eli Lilly. Sylvia Burwell served in the role under Obama. She had previously been the director of the Office of Management and Budget, and before that worked for various large philanthropic organizations. And before Burwell had been Kathleen Sebelius, who was the governor of Kansas. So in short, the Secretary of HHS has been held by individuals who are not scientists or healthcare professionals, but who do have either substantial executive experience and or a long history of public service within government. So now let's talk about our current Secretary of HHS, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Who is the man and how did he get here? RFK Jr. was born in 1954 into the famous Kennedy family, the most influential political family in American history. His father was U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, who was assassinated while running for president. RFK Jr. was 14 at the time. One of his uncles was John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated while serving as president. Another uncle was Ted Kennedy, who was a senator from Massachusetts for 45 years. His aunt Eunice was the founder of the Special Olympics. She married the founder of the Peace Corps, who later became the Democratic nominee for vice president in 1972. And their daughter, Maria Shriver, who is RFK Jr.'s cousin, was a prominent national journalist who was married to Arnold Schwarzenegger, the actor and former governor of California. The extent of RFK Jr.'s familial connections goes on and on. Congressmen, governors, ambassadors, this guy who you love to hate on the White Lotus, and even Chris Pratt is married to RFK Jr.'s first cousin once removed. The point here is that RFK Jr. comes from a place of extreme wealth, extreme fame, extreme influence, and extreme privilege. Remember that when you hear the rest of his life story. In his youth, he was arrested for drug possession and expelled from 2 boarding schools. RFK Jr. was part of a literal gang called the Hyannisport Terrors, who vandalized homes and cars, committed robberies, abused drugs, and generally harassed people around them. He He was reportedly once arrested for spitting ice cream on a police officer. He was just like the rich, bullying high school villain from every teen comedy drama from the 80s. Around this time, he became addicted to heroin. Listen to him claim how heroin abuse led to a phenomenal rise in his academic performance at school.
First of all, I'll tell you something about heroin for me. I did very, very poorly in school until I started doing narcotics. Then I went to the top of my class because my mind was so restless and turbulent. And I could not sit still. I could not, the teacher would be at the front of the room talking, and it would be just like noises coming out of her mouth. In school, I was non-compos mentis. I had no idea what was happening, and I was at the bottom of my class. I started doing heroin. I went to the top of my class. Suddenly, I could sit still, and I could read, and I could concentrate. I could listen to what people were saying, and things made sense to me.
For the record, in the history of the world, heroin addiction has never made someone a better student. And just this year, his cousin Caroline Kennedy accused him of not just abusing drugs on his own, but also encouraging his siblings and cousins down the path of substance abuse. She called him a predator. Notably, RFK Jr.'s brother died from a drug overdose in 1984. But RFK Jr. is still Kennedy, so despite these legal problems and a personality somewhere between Biff Tannen and Draco Malfoy, he's accepted into Harvard and then UVA Law School, while his drug abuse is continuing. After law school, he's arrested for heroin possession, but he's still Kennedy, so he gets probation and community service. Around this time, he manages to become a practicing attorney, and after this, at least publicly, his image transforms a bit. His law practice focuses on environmental protection, such as combating pollution of waterways in New York State. He also worked with indigenous rights groups from around the world. And this is what he did for 20 years, seemingly quite respectable, focusing on non-fringe progressive causes, having outgrew his wayward youth. But alas, that respectability did not last. RFK moved away from environmental litigation to a career dominated by conspiracy theories and medical misinformation, particularly concerning vaccines. The details of why this transformation occurred is not clear, but over the last 20 years, he's evolved into one of the world's most influential anti-vaxxers, most prominently as the chairman of the ironically named Children's Health Defense, an organization that exists largely to discourage the use of life-saving vaccines in children. The most known of this group's work has been their campaign of misinformation on the completely and totally discredited claim that an epidemic of autism is due to a mercury-containing MMR vaccine. His visit to the nation of Samoa in 2019 fueled a period of vaccine hesitancy in that country that resulted in a massive measles outbreak that killed 83 people. RFK has maintained that he has no responsibility whatsoever for these dead children. RFK claims, quote, "I'm not really anti-vax, I'm just in favor of safe vaccines." Here he is at his Senate confirmation hearing talking about this last January.
I am pro-safety. I worked for years to raise awareness about the mercury and toxic chemicals in fish, and nobody called me anti-fish. And I believe that that vaccines play a critical role in healthcare. All of my kids are vaccinated. I've written many books on vaccines. My first book in 2014, the first line of it is, "I am not anti-vaccine," and the last line is, "I am not anti-vaccine."
Yet despite his testimony, he's teamed up with other infamous anti-vaxxers, produced an anti-vax documentary, written anti-vax articles for the mainstream press, and written anti-vax books himself. Here he is on a podcast in 2023.
You've talked about that the media slanders you by calling you an anti-vaxxer. And you've said that you're not anti-vaccine, you're pro-safe vaccine. Difficult question. Can you name any vaccines that you think are good?
I think some of the live virus vaccines are probably averting more problems than they're causing. There's no vaccine that is, safe and effective.
So when he now claims he is not anti-vax, he is lying. However, notably, RFK's anti-vax convictions are among his most conventional and least bizarre beliefs on science. On other things, he's so far outside the mainstream that even other anti-vaxxers are looking at him like, Bobby, come on, really? He's claimed that chemicals in drinking water change children's sexuality and gender identity. He's claimed that mass shootings are the consequence of antidepressants. He suggested multiple times that HIV is not the cause of AIDS, despite this being universally accepted by the international medical community for decades. More generally, he's been skeptical of germ theory, the idea that microscopic organisms are responsible for infectious diseases, instead favoring the miasma theory of the ancient Greeks, in which epidemics were thought to be spread by, quote, bad air. I don't understand how RFK reconciles his apparent disbelief in germs with his claims that Lyme disease is a bioweapon developed by the US government and that COVID-19 may have been engineered to spare Jewish and Chinese people.
We've put hundreds of millions of dollars into ethnically targeted microbes. The Chinese have done the same thing. In fact, COVID-19, there's an argument that it is ethnically targeted. COVID-19 attacks certain races disproportionately. COVID-19 is targeted to attack Caucasians and black people. The people who are most immune are Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese.
Yes, he's really said all those things. He's promoted conspiracy theories about supposed chemtrails, the laughably absurd idea that the completely normal water vapor trails that follow airplanes in the sky as a consequence of natural physical processes are instead caused by nefarious entities dumping chemicals on the public to harm us for who knows what purpose. Here's a video of him from last winter adding what appears to be methylene blue to something that he was drinking on an airplane. Methylene blue is a real medication that is very rarely used intravenously in ICU settings for people with certain types of unusual poisoning or drug toxicity. Drinking methylene blue on your own is very bizarre. The bizarreness of RFK extends beyond his beliefs in pseudoscience to other aspects of his life. Now, for most of the people in this video series, Vinay Prasad, Jay Bhattacharya, Marty McCary, their personal lives are not directly relevant to the question of whether or not they can do their jobs. But RFK Jr.'s personal behavior is so extreme, we do need to consider it. In 2012, RFK Jr.'s daughter Kathleen reported in an interview with Town & Country magazine that when she was a child, her dad had used a chainsaw to cut off the head of a beached whale and then strapped the head to the roof of their minivan for a 5-hour drive home. An event that, for the record, he denies. However, here's RFK Jr. himself recalling another bizarre incident involving a dead bear that he placed in New York City's Central Park.
And that woman in a van in front of me hit a bear and killed it, a young bear. So I pulled over and I picked up the bear and put him in the back of my van because I was going to skin the bear. And it was very good condition, and I was going to put the meat in my refrigerator. And you can do that in New York State. You can get a bear tag for a roadkill bear. And at the end of the dinner, it went late, and I realized I couldn't go home. I had to go to the airport. And the bear was in my car, and I didn't want to leave the bear in the car because that would have been bad. But I said, let's go put the bear in Central Park and we'll make it look like he got hit by a bike. It'll be funny for people. So everybody thought that's a great idea. So we went and did that, and we thought it would be amusing for whoever found it or something.
The fact that this prank, so to speak, seriously inconvenienced scores of hardworking New York City police officers and park employees seemed to not register with him. He's joking about the incident. As true to form, he has no appreciation or interest in how his actions affected other people. How much of their time he wasted on this, or even how many parents didn't take their kids to the park because they read in the newspaper that there was a bear there. More recently, he posted a picture of himself swimming with his grandkids in Washington, D.C.'s Rock Creek Park, where swimming has been banned for 50 years due to chronically high levels of fecal bacteria. Perhaps that decision was influenced by his skepticism that germs are even real. I don't know, but I do hope the kids were okay. And of course, I previously reported on here about the saga of his brainworm infection, which we only know about because he disclosed it during divorce proceedings while arguing that the infection reduced his cognitive function to the point that his earning potential was lower, presumably because he wanted to pay his ex-wife less alimony. Ironically, it didn't matter since the woman he was divorcing took her own life shortly after the divorce. And that poor woman divorced him after he admitted to cheating on her dozens of times with dozens of different women. He has an infamous problem with sex addiction, which allegedly is not always consensual. In response to a 2023 accusation by a former family babysitter that he had sexually assaulted her in 1999, RFK allegedly told a reporter, quote, "I have so many skeletons in my closet, I'm not going to comment on it." Just last year, while married to his third wife, RFK had a sex scandal involving an engaged political reporter half his age who had covered his presidential campaign. Cutting off whaleheads with a chainsaw, staging a bear hit and run in America's most famous city park, swimming with grandkids in sewage, casually drinking a medication that's intended to be used intravenously within the ICU, following up serial infidelity with a claim that a brain parasite has made you too impaired to pay proper alimony. These are not the actions of a mentally stable individual. So that's who RFK Jr. is. He was born into extreme wealth and privilege, was a delinquent as a teen and younger adult, avoided consequences because of his family, had a run as a respectable environmental lawyer before falling down a rabbit hole of medical misinformation, conspiracy theories, laughably absurd pseudoscience, and bizarre personal behavior that is devoid of any sense of personal responsibility or empathy for other people. There is no sugarcoating this. He is both a lunatic and a terrible person. Saying that is not character assassination. It is the undeniable truth supported by a lifetime of well-documented incidents and statements. With that in mind, what has RFK accomplished during his first 8 months as HHS Secretary? Well, he's done a lot of terrible, even catastrophic things, and the list is constantly growing. These are just some highlights. Near the end of March, he announced that he would be eliminating 10,000 jobs within the HHS. That's 12% of the workforce that keeps us safe and healthy. True to form, RFK has expressed no empathy for the now unemployed. Shortly later, he tweeted out, quote, "The revolution begins today," as he welcomed Jay Bhattacharya and Marty Makary to their respective roles as heads of the NIH and FDA. In April, RFK was focused on autism, but his comments and approach did not land well. Here he is talking about the impact of autism on children.
Autism destroys families. More importantly, it destroys our greatest resource, which are our children. These are children who should not be suffering like this. These are kids who, many of them were fully functional and regressed because of some environmental exposure into autism when they're 2 years old. And these are kids who will never pay taxes, they'll never hold a job, they'll never play baseball, they'll never write a poem, they'll never go out on a date. Many of them will never use a toilet unassisted. And we have to recognize we are doing this to our children.
Despite RFK talking about vaccines and autism for decades, I'm starting to wonder if he's ever actually met someone with autism. Because the people with autism that I've met and who I've taken care of, they participate in society, they hold jobs, they play sports, they date, they get married, have kids, and believe it or not, use a toilet unassisted. It's as if his entire knowledge of autism comes from the movie Rain Man, which is a relatively realistic depiction of a person at the extreme end of the autism spectrum who also had savant syndrome. In spring, RFK also pledged to find the underlying causes of autism by September, promising to achieve in 5 months what medical science had failed to accomplish over decades. He had already hired the ethically challenged quack David Geyer to review vaccine safety data as it relates to autism. Geyer is a well-known anti-vax activist who was disciplined by the state of Maryland in 2012 for practicing medicine at his father's medical clinic without a license, where the two of them gave hormone blockers to children with autism, seemingly as part of some bizarre, unsanctioned, and unregulated experiment of their own. Their version of an institutional review board to ensure the ethics of what they were doing literally included one of their wives, several business associates, and the parent of one of the treated children. And this is the person who RFK has entrusted with researching a link between autism and vaccines. And for the record, once again, vaccines do not cause autism. There may be nothing in clinical medicine that is as well supported with scientific evidence as that statement. As to RFK's promise to uncover the cause of autism by September, we're going to come back to that in a few minutes. In May, RFK led a group in publishing the much-hyped Make America Healthy Again report. The 72-page document was an attempt at an indictment of our current state of health, commenting on such things as our diet, chemicals in the environment, and prescription drug use among children. But as expected, there was literally nothing about gun violence, automobile accidents, the insurance industry, and problems of access to medical care, or the impact of race, gender, or poverty on health outcomes. It also did not take long for astute readers to realize that the report cited at least 4 papers that did not exist and dramatically mischaracterized findings of 3 others. It is all but certain that the source of these citation errors was the fact that generative AI, possibly ChatGPT, was used to write at least part of it. And it just wasn't proofread by someone skilled enough to identify these problems. Now, if one of my medical students did something like that for their PhD thesis, they would possibly be kicked out of the program altogether. They would certainly not be allowed to simply re-edit it and submit a fixed draft 2 days later, like RFK did. In June, RFK abruptly fired the 17 members of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. I'm going to have a whole video about this committee and the shit show that has followed their firing, but in extreme brief, this committee, which sits within the CDC, provides non-binding advice on the use of vaccines in the United States, which are functionally the official recommendations from the federal government. Historically, the committee has been composed of scientists and physicians with specific expertise in vaccine development, infectious diseases, and/or epidemiology. Well, no more. RFK replaced the previous committee with a group of 7 totally new people, of whom the majority are either openly anti-vax and/or have literally zero relevant expertise. He's since added 5 more members who are no better. According to Senator Bill Cassidy, a former physician himself whose support of RFK's nomination was instrumental in his confirmation, he only supported RFK after RFK promised to leave the ACIP alone. Here he is talking about it to his fellow senators.
He has also committed that he would work within current vaccine approval and safety monitoring systems and not establish parallel systems. It confirmed he will maintain the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices recommendations without changes.
Apparently, RFK's promises are not worth much. August was a busy month for RFK. On August 1st, he had an op-ed published on the relatively obscure website Trial News. In the piece, he argued for, or more accurately demanded, that the well-respected Annals of Internal Medicine retract a study that had been published a few weeks prior. The study in question analyzed the records of 1.2 million Danish children who had been followed for 20 years or so to show that aluminum-based vaccines did not increase the probability of any of 50 different chronic conditions, including autism. RFK's critique was full of enough technical-sounding jargon to make it seem credible to anyone who doesn't study this for a living, but in reality, it was misunderstandings of basic research mixed with gibberish. It takes a phenomenal degree of arrogance and lack of self-awareness to demand a medical journal retract a paper on a topic on which one has absolutely zero knowledge. The Annals of Internal Medicine elected to not retract the study and to not even directly respond to RFK's demand because it was so absurd as to not even warrant a response. RFK followed this on August 5th with an announcement that the NIH was canceling $500 million worth of contracts with universities and private companies to further study and develop mRNA vaccine technology. RFK claimed the mRNA COVID vaccines were ineffective and unsafe, but offered no supportive evidence other than vibes and his parroting pseudoscientific talking points from the usual peanut gallery of pandemic-era quacks. In reality, this technology literally saved hundreds of thousands of lives from COVID, and in recognition of the positive impact it had on the world, the 2023 Nobel Prize was awarded to its most central developers. Continued research on mRNA vaccines is expected to not only protect us against future pandemics, but it also could be used to fight chronic disease and cancer. A story from just 2 weeks prior to this talked about how mRNA technology could lead to a universal cancer vaccine. You'd think that RFK, who frequently rants about modern medicine ignoring the prevention of chronic disease, would be ecstatic about a universal cancer vaccine instead of canceling the research that would make it possible. But that would assume he has at least a trivial understanding of the science and that he actually cares about the public. Then August 8th brought this horrible story.
We begin tonight with new details in that deadly attack in Atlanta. Police identifying the suspect who opened fire near the campuses of the CDC and Emory University. The gunman perched on the rooftop of a CVS, shooting and killing a police officer. New images tonight showing multiple bullet holes piercing the windows at CDC headquarters. At least 4 buildings were hit, but no employees or visitors injured.
A policeman was killed by the gunman, but given that hundreds of rounds were fired, it was miraculous that more people were not. It was a major news story for days. How did RFK respond to it? In his first statement following the shooting, 15 hours later, he tweeted out pictures of himself fishing. Yes, that fishing tweet really did precede his public acknowledgement of the shooting. Susan Menares, the CDC director at the time, has testified to the Senate that RFK did not even bother calling her afterwards. That's like there being a shooting at a high school and the district superintendent not reaching out to the school's principal afterwards. When this is the level of disregard RFK has for someone in his inner circle of Make America Healthy Again, imagine how little he thinks about you and me. Prior to the CDC shooting incident, the gunman had expressed distrust of the COVID vaccines and believed the vaccines had made him personally suicidal. In one document recovered by investigators, the gunman had written, quote, "The COVID shots were always meant to indiscriminately murder as many as possible." Gee, I wonder who could have given him the idea that the vaccines were dangerous and that the CDC and FDA could not be trusted. I would bet every penny I own that RFK feels not one tiny shred of responsibility for this. It's just like the dozens of kids who died from measles in Samoa after he traveled there to spread distrust of that vaccine. Not any hint of personal responsibility. In late August, RFK attempted to fire, by tweet no less, Menares, the CDC director who had just been confirmed a few weeks earlier. Menares, who was arguably the sole voice of reason within the senior leadership of the federal government's healthcare apparatus, refused to acknowledge that she had been fired. Her lawyer correctly pointed out that RFK lacked the legal authority to fire her, and that such action could only come from Trump himself. But this standoff only lasted a day. Within hours of her ouster, 4 other CDC senior officials resigned in protest, publicly posting their resignation letters. Here's a few excerpts from one of them. "I am unable to serve in an environment that treats the CDC as a tool to generate policies and materials that do not reflect scientific reality and are designed to hurt rather than to improve the public's health. The recent change in the adult and children's immunization schedule threatened the lives of the youngest Americans and pregnant people. The data analyses that supported this decision have never been shared with the CDC, despite my respectful request to HHS and other leadership. Having worked in local and national public health for years, I have never experienced such radical non-transparency, nor have I seen such unskilled manipulation of data to achieve a political end rather than the good of the American people. The recent term of reference for the COVID vaccine work group created by this ACIP puts people of dubious intent and more dubious scientific rigor in charge of recommending vaccine policy to a director hamstrung and sidelined by an authoritarian leader. Their desire to please a political base will result in death and disability of vulnerable children and adults. Their base should be the people they serve, not a political voting bloc. In September, Menarez was given the opportunity to tell her side during a hearing of the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. Here's some of her opening statement.
The events leading to my dismissal began weeks before August 25th. On August 2nd, I learned from media reports that experts serving as liaison representatives to the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, the ACIP, including those from major medical societies, had been removed from its working groups. The following week, I heard concerns that the ACIP might alter childhood vaccine schedule at its September meeting, potentially without credible supporting data. On August 8th, a gunman, driven by vaccine distrust, fired 180 rounds into CDC headquarters in Atlanta, killing Officer David Rose. On the morning of August 25th, Secretary Kennedy demanded two things of me that were inconsistent with my oath of office and the ethics required of a public official. He directed me to commit in advance to approving every ACIP recommendation, regardless of the scientific evidence. He also directed me to dismiss career officials responsible for vaccine policy without cause. He said if I was unwilling to do both, I should resign. I responded that I could not pre-approve recommendations without reviewing the evidence, and I had no basis to fire scientific experts. He told me he had already spoken with the White House several times about having me removed. For 3 decades, I have worked at the intersection of public health, science, and technology innovation, always challenging the status quo and welcoming the changes that come from research and discovery. Even under pressure, I could not replace evidence with ideology or compromise my integrity.
So in short, RFK had Trump fire the newly confirmed director of the CDC, a well-respected lifelong scientist, because she would not fire other scientists without cause and would not rubber stamp approval of new vaccine recommendations that were made in contradiction to scientific evidence. Then, just a few days ago, President Trump, backed up by RFK and FDA Commissioner Marty Makary, announced during a bonkers press conference that Tylenol use by pregnant women had been found to be the cause of autism, or at least one cause. True to the form of their COVID-era history, these guys have cherry-picked the one piece of evidence that supports their view, a, quote, qualitative synthesis, just published last month. And they ignored the vast quantity of superior evidence that showed no such link. But RFK had promised in April, remember he promised in April that we'd have the autism epidemic figured out by September. And since the evidence against it being due to vaccines is unassailable, I suppose he had to come up with something. But now pregnant women who are in pain or who are experiencing a fever will suffer because they will be paranoid about this bullshit claim. Even pregnant women who otherwise don't trust the word that RFK says, they're still going to think twice about Tylenol now. And to be clear, fever in pregnancy is not just uncomfortable, it's potentially dangerous for the unborn child, which seems contrary to MAGA's strongly pro-life assertions. Plus, some of these women will now be taking meds like ibuprofen for pain and fever, which are known to be harmful after week 20. During the press conference, they also touted the chemotherapy drug leucovorin as treatment for autism based on the flimsiest of evidence. As a renowned pediatrician and vaccine researcher, Paul Offit put afterwards, quote, "That was the most dangerously irresponsible press conference in the realm of public health in American history." Also, after the press conference, something interesting was discovered about the senior authors of that paper on which RFK and Trump had relied to link Tylenol with autism. That author is current Harvard School of Public Health Dean Andrea Baccarelli, he had received approximately $150,000 to testify against the manufacturer of Tylenol in 2023. Baccarelli served as an expert witness on behalf of patients suing Johnson & Johnson. The case was so fraught with a misrepresentation of science that it was thrown out of court. And this is the one guy that RFK, Trump, and McCary had placed all their faith in. And regarding the claim that leucovorin could be used to treat autism, well, who would have guessed that Dr. Oz is or was an investor in a company called iHerb that sells folinic acid, the generic over-the-counter or over-the-internet form of leucovorin. And look, within 2 days, iHerb was already fully out of stock of folinic acid. For what it's worth, earlier this year, Oz claimed that he would sever ties with the company and divest his stock. But whether or not that divestment has actually happened, who knows? This brings us up to today. With all those terrible things that RFK has already done in his first 8 months, where do I think he will go from here? I fully expect him to continue to interfere with the previously independent work of the ACIP to encourage a strong anti-vax bias in their recommendations, particularly for childhood vaccines, but not only for childhood vaccines. Although Casey Means is not yet confirmed as Surgeon General, assuming she will be, I fully expect RFK to direct her to also convey a relatively vaccine-skeptical viewpoint to the public. As a consequence, we should expect to see more reemergence of nearly eradicated childhood infections, like this year's measles outbreak. But instead of being a one-off incident or a rare incident, it's going to start happening every year and be more widespread. Mumps and polio could make comebacks too. RFK will strongly influence McCary as FDA commissioner to be inappropriately resistant to approving new vaccines. He's going to insist on placebo-controlled trials for any new vaccine, regardless of whether or not that superficially reasonable stance is actually ethically and methodologically sound, as would be the case with the annual flu vaccine. He will also encourage the NIH to study vaccine injuries instead of developing new vaccines for things like HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria. We've already seen his hostility to mRNA technology spill over into statements and actions of others in HHS leadership. As a consequence, literally millions of people around the world could die from diseases that could have been prevented. If that number sounds too large to be true, consider that vaccines overall are estimated to have saved 150 million lives over the last 50 years. Even delaying an effective malaria or HIV vaccine by 4 years is missing an opportunity to save tens or even hundreds of thousands of lives. To willingly pass that up in pursuit of a non-scientific, politically motivated agenda, it's just absurd and shows how callously RFK disregards the lives of people both in this country and around the world. I also expect RFK will attempt to reform the process by which vaccine injuries are compensated. This will likely require assistance from Congress, which he might not get because of the financial ramifications to some billionaires. But I think he will try to put the vaccine manufacturers more on the hook for problems that patients falsely believe to be vaccine-related injuries. For example, imagine if Merck or GlaxoSmithKline could be sued by every parent who believes the MMR vaccine caused their child's autism. Even when that cause-effect relationship does not exist, every case still needs to be fought in court. How long would it take for those companies to conclude that making vaccines is not financially sustainable? A few hours, maybe? To be clear, in the United States, people who are harmed by vaccines, they are compensated. It's just that they're compensated via the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, but the injury has to be consistent with scientific evidence. And the money comes from the government, not the companies, because otherwise the companies would stop making vaccines altogether. This system has been in place since the Reagan administration in the 80s. It actually works really well and is ironically much easier from the harmed patient's perspective than it would be for them to individually hire an independent attorney to sue a giant corporation. My last point about vaccines and the next 3.5 years, I do not see any agency or office that falls under HHS to be a reliable source of information on them. Granted, as a hospitalist, I do not routinely order vaccines for my patients. That's typically done in primary care. However, I am now ignoring everything our federal government says about vaccines. When it comes to my own practice and the personal health of myself and my family, I'll be using recommendations from trusted professional societies, other Western nations, and possibly the newly announced West Coast Health Alliance, which will be an organization sponsored by the states of California, Washington, and Oregon, meant to take the place of the CDC, at least temporarily, as a trusted source of public health information. Moving on from vaccines, I also expect RFK to continue his pseudoscientific crusade against fluoridation of water. I expect him to return to ranting about nutrition education in medical schools being inadequate, which has a little truth to it, but is mostly bullshit, a topic for a future video. I expect RFK will continue to criticize the incredibly impactful weight loss medications like Wegovy and Zepbound because he thinks we should all instead just magically eat better through force of willpower alone. I think he will continue to criticize the use of artificial food dyes and use the Trump administration to strong-arm companies into eliminating them from their products. To be fair, I don't think Red 40 and Yellow Number 5 need to be in our food. But at the same time, they are not responsible for all the chronic illnesses that RFK believes. And through all of this, complaining about food dyes and seed oils and weight loss drugs and the lack of nutrition classes for doctors, RFK will continue to completely ignore the true sources of poor nutrition in this country. The lack of access to affordable, nutritious food on account of income inequity, food deserts, and dysfunctional agricultural policy that incentivizes the production of garbage in the interest of profits for big agricultural corporations. Beyond nutrition, RFK will continue to ignore the true greatest risks to our children, automobile accidents and firearms, and he will continue to ignore the fundamental problems inherent to the absurd for-profit structure of the American healthcare system, which leaves millions of Americans uninsured and underinsured. Lastly, if RFK doesn't first succumb from a testosterone-triggered stroke or heart attack, once he's no longer part of the administration, I fully expect him to once again capitalize on and profit from the vaccine distrust that he is deliberately sowing in this country. And to better understand how that would work, here's an informative exchange between RFK and Senator Elizabeth Warren during his confirmation hearings.
Kennedy, I want to start with something that I think you and I agree on, and that is that Big Pharma has too much power in Washington. You've said that President Trump asked you to, quote, clean up corruption and conflicts. Sounds great. You've said that you will, quote, slam shut the revolving door between government agencies and the companies they regulate. That also sounds great. So here's an easy question. Will you commit that when you leave this job, you will not accept compensation from a drug company, a medical device company, a hospital system, or a health insurer for at least 4 years, including as a lobbyist or a board member?
Can you just repeat the last part of the question? Can I commit
You're
to
not going to take money from drug companies in any way, shape, or form.
Who? Me?
Yes, you.
Oh. Yeah, I'm happy to commit to that.
Okay, good. That's what I figured. I said it's an easy question to start with. And I think you're right on this question.
I don't think any of them want to give me money, by the way.
Let's keep going. You're right because to say yes, because every American has the right to know that every decision you make as our number one health officer is to help them and not to make money for yourself in the future. So I want to talk more about money. I'm looking at your paperwork right now. In the past 2 years, you've raked in $2.5 million from a law firm called Wisner Baum. You go online, you do commercials to encourage people to sign up with Wisner Baum to join lawsuits against vaccine makers. And for everyone who signs up, you personally get paid. And if they win their case, you get 10% of what they win. So if you bring in somebody who gets $10 million, you walk away with $1 million. Now, you just said that you want the American people to know you can't be bought. Your decisions won't depend on how much money you could make in the future. You won't go to work for a drug company after you leave HHS. But you and I both know there's another way to make money. So, Mr. Kennedy, will you also agree that you won't take any compensation from any lawsuits against drug companies while you are secretary and for 4 years afterwards?
Well, I'll certainly commit to that while I'm secretary. But I do want to clarify something because you're making me sound like a shill. I put
You're the
together
one who
that case. I did the Science Day presentation to the judge on that case to get it into court.
Mr.
The Daubert
Kennedy,
hearing.
Mr. Kennedy, it's just a really simple question.
Yeah,
You've taken in $2.5 million. I want to know if you will commit right now that not only will you not go to work for drug companies, you won't go to work suing the drug companies and taking your rake out of that while you're secretary and for 4 years after. It's just...
I'll commit to not taking any fees from drug companies while I'm secretary.
No. I'm asking about fees from suing drug companies. Will you agree not to do that?
You're asking me to not sue drug companies,
No,
and I'm not going to agree to that,
drug
Senator.
companies as much as you want.
I'm not going to agree to not sue drug companies or anybody.
So let's do a quick count here of how, as Secretary of HHS, if you get confirmed, you could influence every one of those lawsuits. Well, let me start the list. You could publish your anti-vaccine conspiracies, but this time on U.S. government letterhead, something a jury might be impressed by. You could appoint people to the CDC vaccine panel who share your anti-vax views and let them do your dirty work. You could tell the CDC vaccine panel to remove a particular vaccine from the vaccine schedule. You could remove vaccines from special compensation programs, which would open up manufacturers to mass torts. You could make more injuries eligible for compensation even if there is no causal evidence. You could change vaccine court processes to make it easier to bring junk lawsuits. You could turn over FDA data to your friends at the law firm, and they could use it however it benefited them. You could change vaccine labeling. You could change vaccine information rules. You could change which claims are compensated in the vaccine injury compensation program. There's a lot of ways that you can influence those future lawsuits and pending lawsuits while you are Secretary of HHS, and I'm asking you to commit right now that you will not take a financial stake in every one of those lawsuits so that what you do as Secretary will also benefit you financially down the line.
I'll comply with all the ethical guidelines.
That's not the question. You and I, you have said
You're asking me, Senator, you're asking me not to sue vaccine pharmaceutical companies. Yeah, you are. That's exactly what you're doing.
No. Look, no one should be fooled here. As Secretary of HHS, Robert Kennedy will have the power to undercut vaccines and vaccine manufacturing across our country. And for all of his talk about follow the science and his promise that he won't interfere with those of us who want to vaccinate his kids, the bottom line is the same. Kennedy can kill off access to vaccines and make millions of dollars while he does it. Kids might die, but Robert Kennedy can keep cashing in.
Once again, this is who RFK Jr. is. He doesn't care about you. He doesn't care about me. He doesn't care about our families, our patients, or our communities. He lies. He lies to Congress, and he lies to the American people. And why? Ego, money, delusions of grandeur caused by his brain parasite? I don't know. But he's actually even worse than just a liar or an empathy-lacking sociopath, because he also has a total lack of understanding of basic science and a total disregard for experts. Like his boss, RFK always believes that he is the smartest person in the room, no matter how far out of his depth he may be, which is all of the time. Remember, the man who oversees the commissioner of the FDA drinks methylene blue he probably bought off the internet. The man who is responsible for the CDC director getting fired isn't sure that germs are real. The man who demanded a well-respected journal retract a study he disagreed with argued in court that a worm in his brain made him too cognitively impaired to pay his ex-wife proper alimony. Meanwhile, the damage that RFK has already done to American healthcare and to American medical research is incalculable. And for each day he remains as HHS Secretary, it is harder and will take longer to undo his damage. At this rate, it may already take the country a generation to rebuild the NIH and CDC. In an ideal world, the House of Representatives would impeach him tomorrow, and the Senate would then remove him after a trial showcasing all of what I presented today. But today's Republican Party is so beholden and or fearful of Trump, they won't act on their own. So we need to wait until either Trump gets annoyed by him, or until the American people get their act together and elect politicians who are willing to put the needs of their constituents ahead of their personal political ambitions. Until then, let's just pray that we're not hit with another pandemic, because as bad as COVID was, with RFK in charge, it could be so much worse next time around. It is cliche, but elections have consequences, and RFK Jr. is one of ours.